The Indian government began instituting 5-year plans since 1951 with the sole purpose of guiding the economy in a direction which would lead to long-term survival for India. Before getting into a deep discussion about any of the plans, we need to take a step back and discuss the difference between long-term and short-term plans. The easy way to think about this is to imagine that the sum of the short-term plans is to achieve the long-term plans for the economy. In actuality, that means each of the short-term plans serves a specific purpose that can be directly related to some long-term objective. For instance, a short-term goal for a student might be to study hard for their upcoming economics test, whereas the long-term goal would be to finish the course at the top of the class. The Indian long-term plan has 5 distinct objectives, namely, increasing both GDP and GDP growth per capita, achieving full employment, equitable distribution, modernization, and self-sufficiency. Let's first begin with increasing GDP and GDP per capita. Before discussing this, let's make sure that you understand both of these terms clearly. Increasing GDP, short for Gross Domestic Product, is one of the long-term goals of the Indian government, which means that each of the shorter 5-year plans has this target in mind. However, one of the key things that India needs to consider is that because its population growth is so significant, its GDP growth must occur at a pace faster than its population growth. Otherwise, its GDP per capita growth rate will be negative. This measure, the GDP per capita, which we have already discussed in a previous video, is used as a general measure to indicate the standard of living of a particular society. As a result, the Indian government desperately wants to avoid a situation in which its GDP is growing at a rate that is slower than its population growth. But how can they ensure that its GDP growth is maximized? One way to do that is to ensure that all of its citizens who are capable and able to work are engaged in gainful employment. Which brings us directly to the second topic in the long-term goals, full employment. One of the central subtopics in this section is the participation rate, which refers to the number of people who are either employed or are actively looking for work. Generally speaking, if two countries have the same population and the same level of GDP, the country with a higher participation rate is considered to be the more stable. And the reason for this is quite simple. Just imagine a scenario in which we have two countries, each with 10 citizens. Now, imagine that the GDP of each country is 100. In country A, the participation rate is 100%. There is no unemployment, and as a result, the GDP per capita is 10. In country B, the participation rate is 50%, but the GDP per capita is also 10. How do we decide which is the better economy? Well, in each economy, the GDP is the same and the GDP per capita is also the same, but the participation rate tells us that 50% of the people in country B are not engaged in the productive process. This implies that there is a significant gap between the rich and the poor. However, in country A, no such gap exists. Historically speaking, societies which have had a significant income gap have tended to be unstable, as those who are unemployed rely on illegal means to survive, which implies instability on a national level. This leads us into the next topic of equitable distribution. As we just mentioned in the previous example, it is important for the benefits of production to be distributed equally to all members of society. Otherwise, societies become susceptible to crime, as the have-nots of society resort to desperation to fulfill their needs. However, there is an important point to take note of here. Equitable distribution does not mean that all members of society should be paid equally, but rather that all members of society should be paid at a level commensurate with their contribution to society. For this reason, doctors are paid higher than garbage men. But as long as the difference is commensurate with their contribution to society, the income gap is not considered unfair. The next topic, modernization, refers to the updating of technology, especially with regards to know-how and implementation. As you are already aware, one of the ways to increase the GDP is to increase the number of employees a government employs. The next topic, modernization, refers to the updating of technology, especially with regards to know-how and implementation. As you are already aware, one of the ways to increase the GDP is to increase the number of employees a country employs. However, another way to increase GDP is to update technology. You should note that this is not specific to any given sector or industry, but rather the economy as a whole. In recent years, the Indian economy has seen significant signs of improvement in its technology, as witnessed by the Green Revolution and the emergence of India's IT industry. You should also note that the benefits of modernization are not limited to merely increasing the GDP, but also lead to improvements that will improve the social outlook of Indians and lead to much needed changes like the empowerment of women. Finally, let's take a look at one of the most important long-term goals, self-sufficiency. This means to have limited or no foreign dependence on goods, especially for food grains. For any nation that is dependent on another nation, especially for the procurement of food, that could put a nation in a particularly vulnerable position. Imagine a situation where one country depends on another country for all of its rice. The rice-providing nation has all of the leverage it needs in this situation to be able to manipulate the rice demander. For any nation who wants to exercise its sovereignty, this is an absolutely dreadful situation. In fact, in Indian history, such a situation has already occurred once before. In 1965, the United States threatened to stop exports of food grains to India unless they stopped their war with Pakistan. Needless to say, sovereignty, the ability of a nation to govern itself, is one of the most important political tools any government can have. Being subject to the control of another nation as a result of dependence on a specific resource is a very dangerous situation to be in. Now that we have a clear understanding of each of these, let's jump back to the beginning again. We have 5 distinct long-term goals that the Indian government is trying to achieve. Firstly, growth in terms of both GDP and GDP per capita. Secondly, full employment. Thirdly, equitable distribution. Fourthly, modernization. And finally, self-sufficiency. Now that you understand each of these in detail, you'll be able to understand what each short-term plan is attempting to achieve.